So our Sarah,
Hold on, Jason.
there we go.
Back, Jason. There we go. Yep.
So welcome everyone to one of the most, I think, look forward to anticipated sessions of the conference. My name is Patricia Griffin. I'm a professor at Holy Family University, Temple University, and St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And as we begin today, I would like to address and acknowledge that the land on which my university sits and where I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the United States of America, are the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. And I'd like to take this opportunity to honor the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that's brought our institution and ourselves here. But finally, let us recognize that remembering is a starting point, not an ending point. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to a fabulous group of individuals that I've met as a member of the Global Law Enforcement Public Health Association. These individuals are here today to speak with you about intersectionality and how that is an important construct as well as a pathway for really bridging these areas of law enforcement and public health. So with us on the screen today that you'll see from our presenters, we have Mr. Alex Workman, Sarah, Sam, Jason. They join us with diverse experiences in Australia. And Sarah, I'm not exactly sure where you are joining us from.
Great question, Pat. I am in Anchorage, Alaska, on Denina land.
Oh, okay, from Anchorage, Alaska. So their experience and the breadth of their work in the field, and that's what really LEFA is about. LEF has provided this sort of forum where practitioners, academics, and community members can come together and share lived experiences and reimagine or reframe how we go about doing our work. And really, you know, that the theme of this conference was defying boundaries. And when I think about the wonderful work that all of the presenters today are engaged in, I think it really, you know, spotlights the way in which if we just let go of our, you know, established mentalities that we can work in silos, that we can defy those boundaries. So without further ado, I'm going to let these fabulous people introduce themselves before they go into their presentations. And for any of the attendees, if you'd like to type any questions into the chat room, I'll be sure to monitor that. But Alex, would you like to say some words before I turn the session over to Jason for the first presentation, because you're co-chair?
That sounds wonderful. Thank you, Pat. So hello, everyone. So my name is Alex Workman, and as Pat said, I'm a PhD student at Western Sydney University. I am also the co-chair of this special interest group, and it was a conversation that's been happening for quite some time now between myself, Pat Griffin, and the truly incredible Professor Amber Christensen-Fulmer from the University of Alaska in Anchorage, who may be popping in today, but has some prior things going on. So it struck us that with this SIG, it was really something that was missing from the conversation. We seem to be alluding towards intersectionality in our own research. However, it was just missing from the conversation. So we, as part of our SIG, would like to address all types of identity, whether it may be a person's disability status or their Indigenous status, or their culturally and linguistically diverse status, their sexuality, geographical location, and so forth. Because these are really important parts of the conversation where their outcomes may be extremely different when they engage with law enforcement and public health officials. So before I pass the torch on to these wonderful presenters, on behalf of Jason Hesse and Samantha Burton, I would just like to acknowledge the Darug, Gundagara and Tharawal peoples and thank them for their support of Western Sydney University and Greater Western Sydney. I also pay respect to the elders past and present of the First Peoples of Australia. So I'm coming to you from Darug land and Sam's coming to you from Darug land. And Jason, as a nice segue to you, would you like to reflect on the traditional land that you're coming from?
Yeah, hi guys. I want to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm standing on, which is Gadigal land, or known as Sydney. So about 15 minutes out of the city on Gadigal land. But I also grew up and I was raised on Darug land, out where Sam and Alex are living at the moment. So it's about 1 hour northwest of Sydney. I firstly want to acknowledge as well, before I start this presentation, one of the underlying issues here and one of the main take-home points is that sovereignty was never actually ceded. So the Indigenous populations of Australia, we believe, still have sovereign rights over this land, which is one of the main reasons why we acknowledge the land that we're standing on before these presentations. And not only that, also in my workplace and in many other workplaces, it's important to have these conversations to get this message across. Okay, so as some of you might or might not know, not be too familiar with, Captain Cook obviously came to Australia in 1770 and declared sovereignty over Australia, which has led to a lot of the issues with self-determination and other issues relating to that, causing problems for Indigenous communities. So my name's Jason, if everyone knows. I've graduated with a Bachelor of Media and Law at Macquarie University in Sydney. And I've recently finished my diploma in legal practice and will be admitted as a solicitor next month. Thank you, Alex, who has already given me the title of human rights lawyer in the program. I really appreciate that, mate. That's nice of you. So I work with the National Justice Project. We're a non-for-profit human rights law firm. And so we mainly do work with Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, but we also do a lot of work with offshore refugees kept in detention facilities like Manus and Nauru. So we represent a lot of children and families there. And we also do a lot of advocacy work around coronial inquests and things alike. So I firstly want to start off with a disclaimer here. So this presentation in no way seeks to minimize the experiences of Indigenous people in Australia. It's important to note that Indigenous is an inclusive term that I'll be using, but it acknowledges both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which are separate cultures that have different customs and spiritual beliefs. But for this particular presentation, I'm going to be using Indigenous as a term referring to Aboriginal people in Australia, because they actually are overrepresented in all facets of Australian society, including health and youth justice areas. So I'll start off by discussing some key challenges for Indigenous Australians. So one of the main things that I've spoken about initially is the lack of autonomy and self-determination. So this is at the very core of all the issues that we're dealing with in Australia at the moment, and what we're seeing with the injustices in the youth justice field. There's also the closing the gap policy, which is the Australian government's response. So this started in 2007 and was brought in 2008. And that was originally brought in to reduce the 17-year gap in life expectancy between Indigenous and not Indigenous Australians. So there were 7 key targets for that closing the gap policy, which was centered around education, life expectancy, child mortality rates, employment, reading, numeracy, and school attendance. But unfortunately, which we'll discuss later, that has largely failed and we haven't met those targets, predominantly, again, due to the lack of autonomy and self-determination. Just quickly touching on the native title challenges, this is also going back to the lack of self-determination. So what native title is in Australia, it is the acknowledgement of ownership of land for Indigenous people. But the issue with this is it is non-binding. So this native title came out of a 1992 High Court case. So this is our Supreme Court in Australia, our highest court. It was brought by a man named Eddie Mayberg, who was a Torres Strait Islander man. And he lived in between Australia and Papua New Guinea on an island. And basically he has claimed land rights over land in Australia. And in the 1992 High Court case, they were awarded native title. Unfortunately, Eddie passed away 5 months before that hearing, so he didn't actually get to see the result of that, but it is still existing. But the problem with native title is that it can easily be extinguished. So this is, again, going back to self-determination, and they're not actually having existing rights. If, for example, resources are found on that land, the government can claw back the land, and the Indigenous population do not have an opportunity to re-establish traditional ownership, which is a huge problem in itself. We also have the overrepresentation across all formal institutions, and particularly deaths in custody. So recently, the National Justice Project, where I'm working, we've worked with a man who passed away. We worked with his man's family, David Dungay Jr., who died in very similar circumstances to George Floyd. He was in detention and was pinned down by 6 officers, and he repetitively said, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And this is just one of many cases, death in custody cases that we are dealing with. There's also higher mortality rates, and Indigenous people are more likely to suffer from chronic diseases. Moving on to discussing the Australian criminal justice system in a broader context. So as some of you are aware, Australia is an adversarial system. The US is inquisitorial, which means basically that in an adversarial system, the judge listens to both counsels representing parties, whereas inquisitorial, a judge plays an active role in investigating the examination. So in Australia, we have the Commonwealths, which is at the federal level. We have the state and territory governments. Each of them have their own laws creating criminal offences. So this with it brings a lot of problems because we see certain states like the Northern Territory, which I'll talk about later, having issues with legislation that doesn't quite relate to Indigenous populations, and it is frankly quite backwards, and it doesn't assist Indigenous populations in the way that it should. Okay, just moving on. So one of the main things as well is that it is difficult to navigate. It is exceptionally difficult. This is something that we see daily in the organization that I'm working for. We're at capacity at the moment, and we have Indigenous people calling up daily, seeking advice and needing advice, but they're constantly bouncing around organizations because there is a lack of capacity, there's a lack of funding, and there's a huge issue there with access to justice. And as you can see down the bottom here, it's a statistic that's quite alarming, and to me, it doesn't make any sense at all. And it obviously shows that the government hasn't taken the right steps to mitigate this. But in 1992, 1 in 7 adult prisoners was Indigenous. And last year, that ratio has risen to 1 in 4, which it just doesn't make any sense to me with what's going on and everything like that. Moving on to current challenges. So this is a global perspective of the minimum age of criminal responsibility around the world. So as some of you are aware, the age in Australia is 10. So you can see here on the map on the side, most of the world is 12 to 16. But Australia is signatory on the United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child. And despite being basically informed in 2019 that the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child recommended the age of 14 years as the age of criminal responsibility, Australia has still not actioned this in any of the states or territories. So what we can see that in Europe, the average age is about 14 across the board, which is the recommended age. And this is something that we should be moving towards as a nation, because the issue here is that it disproportionately targets Indigenous youth. This is 10 to 17-year-olds. And this is something that we're seeing higher incarceration rates for Indigenous youth, and it's ongoing. So we'll discuss some statistics around that after the next two slides, but I wanted just to discuss and thank you everyone first for participating in the online poll that I put up on the website here. And you can see that most people have said 18, which is interesting, 63% of people. And then obviously going down 16, 14, 12, and 10, with only one person selecting 10 and one person selecting 12. So hopefully we have the opportunity to discuss that at the end of these presentations. So moving on to the statistics, and these are quite alarming. These show you where we are at as a nation and what's actually going wrong. So I'm going to start by firstly talking about the graph here on the right. What this is basically, these are all of our states and territories. You have the Northern Territory up the top, and in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth are over 40 times more likely to go to prison than non-Indigenous people. So this is relative to population as well. So this is, you can see in every single state, there is a huge portion of Indigenous people that are being sent to prison at a young age. So Aboriginal kids, they make up only 6% of all 10 to 17-year-olds in Australia, but they're 54%. So that half of the juvenile detention population, despite being only 6% of all 10 to 17-year-olds. And 53% of overnight prison population is Indigenous youth. So these are Indigenous youth that are often locked up, kept without charges, without being heard overnight. So this is, again, a huge issue. And in 2019, of all 10-year-olds incarcerated, 80% were Aboriginal children. A majority of all youth offences in 2015 and 16 were theft related. So we're seeing a lot of young men being locked up for petty theft offences. And one of the most alarming statistics that I don't have up on the slide here that I just wanted to say was 94% of children in detention aged 10 to 12 returned to prison before they were 18. So you can see the effect that this has on young men. Nearly 100% of 10 to 12-year-olds that were in prison returned when they were 18. So you can see here the government is doing something completely wrong. There's no self-determination, and we need to move in that direction. So moving on to misappropriation of funding. So this is an issue itself, is that in that it's not the amount of funding that's being provided, it is how the funding is being allocated. So you can see here that funding has gone up $3 billion in the last 4 years. However, it's not being allocated to Aboriginal organisations. It's not, there's no self-determination in the allocation of funding. We're seeing government bodies allocating funding to areas that aren't successful in mitigating the youth detention and the rates that are occurring. So I just wanted to give a quick warning here to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers that the following section contains images of deceased persons. So the issues for reform around Indigenous incarceration are that government is lacking accountability. So this can be seen directly recently, actually, in the response to the 2017 Northern Territory Royal Commission, which shows that there's been a very little action that has been made. So a Royal Commission basically in Australia is an investigation into government conduct from external bodies. So this is basically to assess and to provide recommendations on how we can move forward and how we can mitigate loss in these areas. But the issue with that is this week, exactly on Tuesday this week, so this happened only 5 days ago, the Northern Territory's Chief Minister of Justice, Michael Gunner, announced tougher than ever consequences for young people who reoffend or breach bail conditions. So this is only 3 years after the Royal Commission, 4 years, sorry, after the Royal Commission, and the government has backflipped on the recommendations from the Northern Territory Royal Commission, to the point where they're actually bringing in harsher penalties, they're bringing in harsher bail conditions, which no doubt will see the rates spike. So Mick Gooder, who was the commissioner of the Northern Territorial Commission, he said that time and time again, people from our community said, let us use our culture to drive the change that we need to see. I'm not seeing much of that now. This is what he said. And this is, it's quite emotional watching him speak about this, because he put so much work into this Royal Commission, and the recommendations were great, and would most definitely mitigate the loss, but it's gone unheard. So moving on to deaths in custody, as we discussed before, on the picture on the right here, you can see two young men. Unfortunately, these two young men passed away, and the organization that I'm working for is doing a coronial inquest into their deaths. So these two young men were chased by police into the Swan River in Perth. They both drowned, and they were only 14 years old. So we're seeing a huge issue with police culture as well. We're seeing police are pursuing young men, and this is just one of many stories where young men do pass away in police pursuits. But this is an issue going back to police culture in itself. So we need drastic reform in police education around Indigenous legal issues, and also around mandatory sentencing in the Northern Territory. So mandatory sentencing it's a regime that treats juveniles differently from adults. In the Northern Territory, a juvenile can be sentenced to 28 days imprisonment, whereas adults can be sentenced to 14 days for the same crime under Northern Territory. So there's very little discretion here. If they've done something that falls under the umbrella of a certain crime, they can be locked up for 28 days, which is terrible. Okay, moving on to current frameworks and organizations that support Indigenous people. So as discussed, we have the Closing the Gap policy brought in by the Australian government. You can see here on the right are the Closing the Gap targets. So as discussed, early education, Year 12 attainment, and these are the only two that are on track at the moment. But life expectancy, child mortality rates, employment, reading numeracy, and school attendance are all not on track. These are the markers that were set by the government back in 2008, 2009. And we can see that there hasn't been much progress here. And we can go into that in the discussion after as well. We have Legal Aid, which is one of the organizations that we refer out a lot to. But Legal Aid, again, is severely understaffed, underfunded, and there's just not enough capacity to take on the amount of claims and the amount of people that need help. We have the Aboriginal Legal Service, which is a great organization. I encourage you all to look into as well. We have pro bono lawyers. So the organization that I'm working for, a lot of us are pro bono lawyers assisting remote communities and communities closer to metropolitan areas. We have youth justice officers and youth justice supervision. But there has been a lot of stories and claims about misconduct of youth justice officers. So they're basically people that assist Indigenous youth in their court process and everything like that. But there has been a lot of claims of racism and things along those lines with these youth justice officers in remote communities, which is essentially adding to the problem when they're supposed to be assisting. Just closing up, I wanted to address some future directions and possible remedies. So on the right here, we can see all of the Indigenous nations, the Aboriginal nations that exist in Australia. So you can see how significant the culture is and how many different cultures there are, how many languages there are. And this is something that we need to focus on with culturally competent, safe and inclusive education. This is something that I can't stress enough. We need to have mentorship for young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from Aboriginal men and women. So this is based off kinship, based off something that is central to Aboriginal culture, which we really need to focus on. We need to be listening to the voices of Aboriginal people in how to police their young men. This is vital at the stage that we're at. We also need funding for alternative forms of punishment outside of the criminal justice system. And we need more things like circle sentencing, which has been brought in by the New South Wales Australian government in the local courts. So circle sentencing is basically where the presiding magistrate seeks to work with Aboriginal elders and victims, as well as respective members of the community and the offender's family, to determine what the appropriate sentencing is. So this is to reduce reoffending, to prevent children from going unheard. We also need to focus on collaborative partnerships like the Maranguka Justice Reinvestment Project and the organisation that I'm working for, the National Justice Project, which are collaborative partnerships which work together to prevent loss in these areas. But again, most importantly, and I wanted to just close up with this, we really at this time, we need to be listening to the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. That was very insightful, and I think you're doing some exceptionally good work at the National Justice Project. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for getting me involved in this. This is a real honor to be speaking with everyone here. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
You are more than welcome, mate. Okay, so next up is the wonderful Sam Burton. So Sam, do you want to take it away?
Oh, hello everyone. My name's Sam and I'm doing a Masters of Research in men's health, men and boys health. It's an interesting journey so far. In Australia, we have constructions of masculinity that have a popularized narrative that all men think and act in ways that are toxic to themselves and others. So academic popular writing and the media use the term toxic masculinity as a catch-all explanation as to why violence and sexism exists in our society. And it's become the framework for identifying and describing men and their gender influences. So in Australia, toxic masculinity constructions are impacting men and boys' agency and human rights, particularly in regards to their health and well-being outcomes. So it's the only, it's an overgeneralization that men can only ever be violent and aggressive, and that domestic violence campaigns, policy development, legislation, and reporting supports the perception that men can only ever be offenders and women can only ever be the victims. So the construction of toxic masculinity pathologizes masculinity and harms men and boys' sense of their selves. So this is really spilling over into, going to share my screen here. Yes, this is really spilling over into our policies and what's happening with health and well-being for our men and boys in Australia. Have I shared my screen?
Sam's cool on Facebook, guys, if you want to be her friend. Click on the swap displays button up the top. Yep, there we go.
Oh, thank you. I didn't even know that existed. So I'm also going to, start with a disclaimer. It's important to note that this study in no way minimises, excuse me, I've got a bit of a grotty throat, or undermines women's experiences. Women's experience many significant and often poorer outcomes concerning their health. This presentation and subsequent master's thesis seeks to question how policies are socially constructed and how funding is not equitably allocated between men and women's health issues, with the hope that this work will start a conversation about acceptance and inclusivity rather than intolerance and division. A meaningful conversation on men's health issues being included on the Australian agenda is the critical first step to address the unique difference experienced. Nevertheless, it is critical to shed light on the significantly determined lack of equality in Australia for men and boys' health issues, leading to discrepancies in their health and wellbeing outcomes. The current health policies are continuing to reproduce gender inequalities through structures. So understanding how the stereotypical masculinity continues to create disadvantage for men and boys' health and wellbeing is really important. So an overview of boys' issues, health issues to start with. Boys are more likely to be stillborn or miscarried. So their health and wellbeing issues start literally from the moment they're born. 3 out of 4 sudden infant deaths are boys. 3 out of 5 deaths before the age of 15 are boys. 9.6% of boys have a disability compared to 5.7% of girls aged 0 to 14. Boys are 1.5 times more likely to sustain an injury requiring hospitalisation. 1 in 5 boys aged 6 to 17 experienced a mental disorder. Boys are more likely to suffer neglect and physical abuse. And in filicide, boys are more commonly killed than girls. So then when we go to men's health issues, men have a much higher rate of suicide, 3 out of 4 in Australia. Life expectancy for men is 6 years less than women, which is very significant. We have significant higher workplace deaths and injuries, diagnosed more often with cancer. 1 out of 3 men are victims of family violence. 1 out of 6 men suffer depression at any given time. 4 out of 5 heart disease deaths before the age of 65. Around 1 in 20 males are unemployed and 1 in 8 males experience poverty. And we have around 18,400 more men that are homeless than women. So for my research, all of this I've just found just in a very, very few short places that I've researched, which is the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare and the Australian Department of Health and Australian Policy Review. And this is even before any sort of in-depth study has been done. This is just the preliminary things that we found. So even though men have way more health issues than women, we have a national strategy that's going to run from 2020 to 2030, and which is the National Men's Health Policy and a National Women's Health Policy. So the 10 years National Men's Health Strategy is being allocated $19.7 million to funding, but the women's is having $52.5 million. So cancer funding was also had a significant difference, even though more men die from cancer in Australia than women. And in 2019, 26,938 men died from cancer and 21,164 women died from cancer. So we also have $78 million to provide safe places for women and children to live, but there was no extra funding for men, even though we have a much higher rate of homeless men. And in mental health, 17.5 million in this financial year is going to be spent on women and 10.9 million on men. The women have a much more diverse mental health policies, whereas the men's is only really just focusing on suicide and not all the other things that men are suffering from, you know, fatherlessness, just depression in general. All the funding has just been rolled into suicide awareness, which is still fantastic, but it's just not as broad as it could be like the women's health issues are. So in Australia, the funding is very disproportionately allocated to women and girls. We have 8 men's health policies nationwide, but 15 women's health policies that target specifically men or women. And in Australia, we have a women's health minister who looks after all of the things related to women's health, but we do not have a men's health minister. And all of our homeless policies are female focused. And mental health policies, like I said, cover a wider range of women's health issues. So what we need to consider is that, you know, health is a fundamental human right. Inclusive and more comprehensive education for men and boys on detection, prevention and intervention for all health outcomes, equitable distribution of funds for health research, and creating diverse understandings of men's health, especially experiences of cold men, all-inclusive health policies for men. So in a lot of our waiting rooms, for example, we have women's magazines and children's toys in the waiting room, but this sends a message that men are not welcome. And our men's prostate cancer awareness campaigns are often on the back of women's toilet doors, but not on the back of men's toilet doors in the same establishments. So blaming social constructions of masculinity almost takes away the government's responsibility for men's health outcomes. So the way forward is to, I think, provide apply a more gendered informed lens to public health and have outreach programs in sporting clubs and workplaces, promoting digital men's health services, flexible practice hours for GPs and medical clinics, male-focused community healthcare interventions, having a maternal healthcare structure that includes fathers, parental healthcare and not just mothers and children, and education on early detection of testicular cancer and prostate cancer, such as educating boys and men on how to check their testicles for cancer. So I think education is a really big thing, and we need policies that reflect a real concern for our men and boys, because at the moment, that's not the way that our policies are reflecting. And I think a greater understanding of how these representations of men and boys is needed to support change here in Australia. And we've had in the past couple of weeks a lot of political, I guess, we've had a lot of, it's like the Me Too movement all over again in Australia. And so yesterday, a school in one of our states made all the boys in the school stand up and apologise to the girls for their gender. I'm not really sure what message that is sending to our boys, you know, to find their place in the world. So I think that it's a big problem in Australia. I'm not sure if it's the same where you all are, but I think we need some change. So thank you for listening to me. And thank you so much, Alex, for having this platform for us to vent our frustrations.
You are more than welcome, Sam. And thank you. It's really interesting to see the way in which we can use our positions to give people a voice. So notably for Jason, he can use you know, at face value, the color of his skin, to talk about Indigenous injustices, and particularly here in Australia, would be listened to more so than a person that was actually experiencing those things firsthand. And to add to that, your position as a woman who can advocate on behalf of men and boys. So it's also really important, as you said, Sam, to start challenging what we see in the media, particularly from a male perspective, where those boys had to get up and apologize for the fact that they were born male. You know, that's a problem. That's making such a significant issue here. And what we're seeing coming about here in Australia is there was a really interesting thread on LinkedIn where they were talking about Our Watch, which is a family violence program here, about the protection of women and children. And one of the people in the thread said, but what about the boys? And he had to explain that it was not all men. It wasn't coming from a place of not all men, but he was saying, I have boys who experience harassment, both physical and verbal, from girls, and they get silenced. However, if they were to do the exact same thing to a girl, they would be expelled from school. And he's talking schooling age. So it's really important that we start to deconstruct our understandings of how something like toxic masculinity that's become so popularized is a damaging narrative. So thank you very much. But lastly, Pat, would you like to say something before we pass the torch?
I would, and thank you very much for kind of pulling together those threads, Alex. We do have a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to, and it relates to what Sam shared. So I don't know if we want to save these until the end, or if you wanted to address it right now.
We can address them at the end.
Okay.
That way we can give them all just a moment to reflect and take it all in.
Sounds good.
But thank you, guys. So keep your questions coming, and they will be addressed at the end. But lastly, but not least, is the wonderful Professor Sarah Buckingham from the University of Alaska in Anchorage. Yeah, so we've got at least one person stateside where it's not some ungodly hour. So Sarah, would you like to take it away?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you all for hearing me and for being here today. I am going to share my screen here. And I would like this to be a really active presentation. So I am going to ask you to engage in the chat window as we're doing so. So if you've moved away from your computer, please come back to it so you can engage in the chat. And I'm going to try to pull it up so we can be in this space together. So I come from a bit of a different perspective than some of the folks who have already spoken today, because I'm actually a psychologist. So I'm a psychologist. I work at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, which is on Dena'ina lands here in the United States. And identify as both a clinical psychologist and a community psychologist. So I embrace multiple worlds in the work that I do. And one of the biggest threads that runs throughout my work is understanding what I would call unshared truths in order for us to better develop comprehensive understandings of problems to lead us to solutions. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about with you all here today. For those that are not familiar with this area, Dena'ina lands are here at the Cook Inlet here in what is now called the state of Alaska. and what many people know as the municipality of Anchorage. Anchorage is an incredibly diverse community, both made up of Indigenous peoples from all over the state, as well as lots of colonial settlers and lots of folks who were forced to migrate to this area because of challenges in their home countries, or have chosen to migrate and have been welcomed into the community. I'm going to be talking about what I call unshared truths today. And when I speak about that, people oftentimes think, oh, am I talking about post-truth, right? Fake news. And we hear a lot about that. I'm sure you hear about that in Australia. We hear about that a lot in the United States today. What is truth? Has truth disappeared? And my argument isn't that truth has disappeared, but rather that we've always had slightly different versions of truth. We know that as human beings, we have lots of different experiences, understandings that shape how we perceive what is happening throughout the world. And some of those perceptions get codified as truth. And so that's the point of our talk today, is to figure out whose truth gets codified as truth and presented as truth, and how does that impact the solutions we come up with as a society for problems. And you're not intended to actually be able to read this. This is a map of all of the cognitive biases that psychologists have identified. So if you go to the middle, and hopefully you can squint and probably not even make them out, but there's lots of different natural processes that happen in our brains that we've been primed to do that shape how we end up perceiving the world and how we go about walking in it. And so I'm going to present to you just a few optical illusions to help you get a sense of some of what those cognitive biases look like. So first off, I would love for you to put in the chat window how many colors of spheres you see here. And panelists can join in too. So just put your best guess for the number of colors of spheres. I'm seeing 3. Seems like we have a consensus at 3. Well, Megan is going for 1, and Kristen's going for 1 as well. Got 4 from Frank. Alex says maybe 4. Colorblindness definitely plays a role. Sarah says 4. So the ones have it. There's actually only one color of sphere that's happening here. What ends up happening, if I go back to this other picture, you can see that for some of the lines are brought to the forefront over the spheres, right? So green was brought to the forefront over this sphere, where blue was brought to the forefront over this sphere. And so what ends up happening is we judge the color of the sphere based on what is surrounding it, right? So our circumstances that we're viewing are always impacting our perceptions. Here's another one. How many black dots do you see here? Alex says 12. Sam says 2. Frank says 12. 1, 2, 12. All right, for my folks who answered 12, you're actually correct. Can you see all 12 dots at the same time? And Megan's answered to that already. No, they keep moving around, right? So we can't actually see all of these dots at the same time. It's impossible for us. What ends up happening is we focus in on an area and then we can see the minute details, but then all of the rest of what we're seeing gets just kind of combined into gray in our periphery, right? So what we focus on, we actually see a detailed understanding of, but we can't see all 12 dots at once because we can't focus in on all of the details at once. Here's another one. What would you call, what do you see here? Give me the variety of shapes that you see. I like the Pac-Man. That's what I call it.
Pac-Man.
And 2 triangles. Pies and triangles. Pie's missing a slice. Yeah. So a lot of you probably see triangles, right? But there actually isn't a triangle here, right? That is empty space. There is no triangle built in, but we have been primed to know what the shape triangle is. And so we naturally draw that conclusion from this empty space, from the Pac-Man figures, from these lines, that there must be a triangle here, right? And our brains are naturally doing this in all the time. They're filling in details to make sense of something, all right? Here's the last one I'm going to show you. What animal or creature do you see here? I vote for a walrus, donkey, donkey and rabbit, kangaroo, donkey, seal, sea lion, donkey. So psychologists back in the mid 2000s presented this to lots of different participants. They're cognitive psychologists, and they looked at what participants would respond based on the priorities that they set. So for one set of participants, they said, gosh, you're going to get points for every marine creature that you see. And with the other group, they said, you're going to get points for every farm animal that you see, right? So not surprisingly then, the folks that were primed for farm animal naturally saw a donkey or a horse or something like that. And the folks that said marine creature, right, saw a seal or a walrus or a sea lion, something like that, right? Suggestions play a massive difference in how we perceive the world as well. And so I share this with you to say that this is a massive kind of generalization, but our perception depends on lots of different things, right? It depends on the circumstances that surround what's going on. It depends on where we're focusing our attention. It depends on our experiences, and it depends on what is suggested to us from others or from leaders within society. And so all of that comes into play as we talk about how we construct truth, right? And we spend a lot of time, and I think that our presentations have really pulled for us to interrogate problems, which I love. We spend a lot of time in society assuming that we understand problems, and we spend the vast majority of our time on solutions. But what I would propose to you today is that we actually need to interrogate how we understand what problems are, because they lead to very different solutions, right? And one of the bubbles or sets of things that plays a role in how we understand problems is our training and expertise, right? We all come from different disciplines here, and I hope the attendees are from a variety of disciplines too. And that training and expertise plays a big role in how we define problems, right? So I, as a psychologist, might see things very different than someone who works in the criminal justice system, because I've been trained to understand things differently and I have a different expertise. The second bubble is our worldview. And a worldview is such a complicated, nebulous thing, but we can basically define it as being made up of our values, our cultures, and our assumptions. And they all get enculturated into us over time, and they come from a wide variety of life experiences that we've had and how we've been treated and how we've walked through the world. And so one of the ways that I like to think about worldview is kind of this intersection of lots of different characteristics within us. So if you could take for a moment just to reflect on yourself and on your worldview, you can think about the age that you are now, if you have any developmental or acquired disabilities over your lifetime, what your religion is, what your ethnicity is, what your socioeconomic status is, your sexual orientation, your indigeneity, your national origin, your gender, just to name a few. This is actually Pamela Hayes's model, which I adore. So it's the dressing model of thinking about our diversity. All of these characteristics influence how we're treated in the world, how we walk through the world, and therefore how we perceive the world. And they all make up our worldview. And so if we take a variety of people that I have put here in different colors, when we have these different intersecting characteristics, we share them with other people, right? We are not wholly distinct from other people. And yet we're more distinct from other people than some people, right? Some people share a much more similar worldview and training experience to us than other people do. And so when we have a problem then, and we put a problem forward, there's going to be certain sets of people who have a shared understanding of that problem or how they define that problem, right? Remembering going back to how our perceptions are shaped. But if we think about this whole and we instead consider like our orange person and our green person, they have unshared understandings, right? Or different understandings of what truth is or how they might define a problem. So then I ask you, is whose problem definition becomes institutional truth, right? If we're all looking at problems differently, whose is right, whose is wrong, who do we define as knowing truth in our society? Is it orange? Is it green? Is it some amalgamation of the two somehow, even if they have very different understandings? And so this is where we have to come back to the rest of our bubbles, right? So we talk about this a lot. I don't know if you guys hear this a lot in Australia, but in the United States, we talk about, for example, we go, oh, well, the solution must be we need to diversify our police force, right? We need to have a much broader set of individuals with different worldviews that are sitting there. But we have to keep in mind that's only one of the bubbles, right? That's only one piece of the solution. That is certainly helping us to broaden our problem definition, but it is not fixing the whole issue, right? We have to consider other things as well. And Sam spoke to this really nicely, and Jason spoke to this as well, right? Part of it's about resources. How are we allocating resources? The way that we allocate our resources massively impacts how we define our problems. One example from my line, I do a lot of research, right? And in my world, so we have in the United States, we have the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and we have the NSF, the National Science Foundation. And gosh, they love to fund biomedical research in psychology. So what do you think the vast majority of our papers are about as our field moves forward, right? They're about a biomedical definition of problems, right? That then lead to biomedical solutions because of how we have allocated our resources. And it also comes back to simplicity, right? The simple answer is the one that we're drawn to. It's Occam's razor, right? The simple answer is the one that we like. And so we have to think about how that plays a role in our problem definitions too. And so I want to give you just one more example. Homelessness is a huge issue here on Oneida Lands in Anchorage, and is around the United States. And so there's been lots of folks who have talked about homelessness, right, or houselessness, and we've defined it in very different ways. So I'm curious, if you had to take a guess at the main driver of homelessness, what you might put forward, what would you think? And if you could hazard a guess in the chat window, that would be great, if you're brave. So I've got violence, substance use, economy, lack of employment, mental illness, loss of job. Does anyone notice any trends in the answers that are given?
That they're all external?
Yeah, they're all external, but they're still coming down to the individual level, right?
Yeah.
We are naturally drawn to individual definitions for problems. Again, because it's a simpler answer, right? It's much easier for us to think about individuals and how that leads to homelessness than broader structures, right? And there are broader structures that are named in a lot of this, but still we're coming down to kind of individual level factors, right? So people will talk about some sort of personal deficit, substance use, mental illness, or domestic violence, when the real driver of homelessness is actually lack of affordable housing. That is the #1 driver of homelessness, right? Now, what has society done about this? Well, in my country and in my community, our solutions have been largely individual in nature, right? We proposed providing counseling to people who are experiencing houselessness, substance use treatment, case management, job training, right? All of these sorts of things. But if we were to turn to more community level solutions that match our problem definition, we would create more affordable housing, right? And this comes down to what Mary Beth Shin, who's a wonderful community psychologist, she talks about the musical chairs of homelessness, right? So whenever we don't have enough affordable housing, it's like not having enough chairs and musical chairs. And so certainly those individual factors play a role in who gets the chair, who gets the house. But if we never have enough houses, enough affordable houses, then we're never going to solve the issue, right? And so thinking about things broadly. And so there's a lot of consequences here. And, when we have these unshared truths and incomplete problem definitions, we have this breakdown among us. And we see this a lot in the United States and around the globe. We see lots of exclusion, polarization of ideas, and it leads to dehumanization and just as dangerously, really incomplete solutions. And so I always like to go back, going back to my old white guy, but Einstein, there's a wonderful quote from Einstein where he was asked, if you have an hour to save the world, how would you spend that hour? And he said to have replied, well, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes solving it. And I would like us to go back to that. I think we need to spend more time on how we define problems so that we can have more complete solutions. So I don't have great solutions for you today. I'm hoping that's what we can have a dialogue about. But I would offer up the first step is about becoming reflexive or reflexivity. And that's about interrogating what do we know and how do we know what we know. I love this quote, how knowledge is acquired, organized, and interpreted is relevant to what the claims are. And yet we focus really exclusively oftentimes on the claims rather than how we have come to understand those claims for a variety of reasons I won't go into, but I will leave it there and hope we can have more of a dialogue about this moving forward. Thanks for engaging with me, and feel free to look me up if anybody has questions in the future.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. That was awesome, for lack of a better term. Really interactive, but I liked how you challenged us on what we consider truth, and the nice compliments to Jason's and Sam's research, that they there was some really important connections there. So thank you very much. That was great. So what we will now do is, if you guys would like to type in some questions, we can go back to the first question, which was from Jessica Xavier, and this is for Sam. So were they made to apologize for their gender or recognizing their privilege and their harm that women have experienced at the hands of men?
No, they were specifically asked to apologize for their gender, for their collective, for men's collective behavior. Some of these boys were only 12. They had no idea what they were apologizing for. They didn't understand that as boys, they were considered to be, I guess, bad in society. So they were actually asked to stand up and apologize on behalf of their gender for the harms that collectively boys have done to girls. So like I said before, I'm not really sure what message we're sending to the boys. Collectively, are we saying that they're all bad? Yeah. I don't really know what to say about this, because I actually find it quite sad that we're going to, or we are creating this situation in Australia where boys are growing up thinking that they're all bad, that, you know, there's no good in amongst them. And that's not what we should be teaching. We should be teaching respect both ways to both genders, that everybody has the right to be respected, and that we don't have to group. Just because one person in the group does something bad doesn't mean that the entire group is bad. So I'm not sure if anybody wants to say anything else.
Thank you, Sam. I think you've hit a really big nail on the head, which was, you know, makes quite, you know, some generalized sweeping statements about, you know, if it's one problem, it's all of them, which becomes particularly challenging because, as you said, you know, there's a lack of inclusive policy development, and even with to things like domestic violence as well, where here in Australia, only really women are, when I say women, I mean white heterosexual women are really the only ones that gain recognition as being a victim, but only a heterosexual male can only ever really be an offender, and that's quite dominant. It's the dominant narrative here, and particularly with the challenges that we've had in COVID, even some of the resources, and, you know, to touch on what Jason says, where our money goes, and the funding that these, you know, campaigns receive, the policies receive, and the advocacy receives, is significantly challenging our perceptions and what we believe is, you know, a collective truth, and it's a problem. Like, we can't get up there and say it and freely say, hang on a second, yes, we acknowledge that, but we also have to acknowledge the other side of the argument as well, in which for these group of people who shared that collective identity, they experience the same problems, but we don't perceive that they receive the same problems because of what we want to consider as the, you know, for lack of a better word, gospel truths. So yeah, it's problematic.
That's the case too for you, Jason, isn't it? Like grouping all of these young Indigenous boys together. But,
Oh, definitely. That's one of the main issues that we're dealing with for sure, is just pulling all these groups together. Particularly when I was discussing mandatory sentencing, that's one area where everyone's painted with the same brush, and that's a problem in itself, because there's no, as I said, very little discretion, and it's just based on legislation and black and white words that don't have a solid understanding of the context of a lot of these boys' lives and things along those lines.
Yeah, and to touch on your point, Jason, it's really what we fail to kind of take into consideration with the Closing the Gap campaign is the lack of Indigenous inclusivity in the Closing the Gap campaign. So they did a 10-year review of the Closing the Gap campaign, and it continues to fail dismally. And it fails because it's taken from a westernized epistemological perspective, where it doesn't consider Indigenous ways of being and knowing. So we measure success from a Western perspective in quantifiable numbers. You know, success is driven by high scores, the financial income that you may earn, but everything is measurable. But for Indigenous people, that just that's not always the case. You know, what success might be to them is, you know, connection to kin, connection to land, you know, knowledge of the land, you know, having a deeper understanding of where they come from. But we don't actually recognize those types of knowledges as, you know, Western knowledge. But I just wanted to quickly ask you, Jason, with the deaths in custody, is there any resources that you know of or could recommend that people go to if they'd like to know some more information about that?
I'd recommend going to the humanrights.gov.au website. You can see quite a few statistics there, but also in general, in terms of media outlets, news outlets, The Guardian do some great work around this area, deaths in custody, as well as Indigenous legal issues. So I'd encourage a lot of people to actually go look at articles from The Guardian, SBS, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC. So all of these media outlets, they provide quite a good narrative. And that's one of the positives with Australia's media landscape, is there actually has been quite a lot of coverage on these issues, which is important because we need to hear those voices and we need to hear those perspectives. But yeah, I would say if anyone wants to find out about any information about deaths in custody, definitely look into some of the Guardian articles. They have some great articles. And as well, if you have the time, please hop onto the website, the National Justice Project, the organisation I'm working for. We have a few blogs up there and information about deaths in custody, and some of the coronial inquests that we've been involved in, particularly with Indigenous people that have died in custody. And I'm sure everyone's aware of the issue that it exists both in the US and in Australia, but in Australia at the moment, we have had consecutive deaths in custody over the last few months, and only one last week, actually. So it's a big problem, and it's a problem that we haven't adequately addressed, and that it continues. So there's a lot of issues tying in with that.
Yeah, and some of the challenges are the disproportionate, I guess, upholding of certain laws. So there was a case here in Australia, in Western Australia, last year, where an Indigenous woman was died in police custody. So she was put in jail for a non-probationary, like, correctional offence. So she had 8 unpaid fines, which is the most common form of incarceration for Indigenous people, is unpaid fines. And she had $800 worth of unpaid fines. She was in jail for 7 days. It cost the Australian government $8,000 to have her in jail, and she died from untreated septicemia. And so we have to really consider the dangerousness and seriousness of the offences that these people are, by people I mean Indigenous people, are doing. Like, she had unpaid fines, but it cost the government and taxes $8,000 to hold her in prison, when that could have been something that could have been dealt with in community service, for example. She could have worked off her debts in another way. We have some instances of deaths in custody where a young Indigenous boy was having an asthma attack and asked for a puffer, and it took them 3 hours to get him a puffer. And at that stage, he'd actually died from an asthma attack, but something as simple as a puffer couldn't be provided to him to relieve the symptoms of his asthma. So it's, yeah.
Alex, I'd like to just touch on that quickly as well. I spoke about in my presentation a man named David Dungay Jr., who died in similar circumstances to George Floyd. And the circumstances surrounding his death was literally over a packet of biscuits. David had a packet of biscuits in his cell, and there's footage, there's tape of the prison guards telling him to put, he can't have the biscuits, and he said, I need to have biscuits, I've got diabetes, I need to have this insulin, and that led to them actually restraining him to get a packet of biscuits off him. And if you see the footage, it's quite alarming. It's on YouTube. You can actually see the use of force and the overuse of force. It's something that we've seen not only in custody, but outside, just in communities. So this is just the use of police force that has come into the dialogue in the US and in Australia is something that we need to keep having these discussions, because this is something that's so important to reduce this. It's just, where we're at the moment is, yeah.
And as you highlighted, in the Northern Territory, they had a royal commission into the treatment of Indigenous people, and particularly what was quite alarming was we had 2 Indigenous boys who were maybe 10 or 12, who were, one was waterboarded and tortured, and the other one experienced sleep deprivation. So these are children in detention, juvenile detention facilities that are being tortured when we're breaching, international human rights law for our treatment of kids, like, children who have no idea of really the consequences of their actions, So it's important. Yeah, continue, Sam, sorry.
Sorry, I think, we need a human rights approach to most things, even to health. And in that situation with those Indigenous children in the Northern Territory, Australia was cited for breaches of human rights over those treatments. And when they went to the facility, when they were doing the investigation and they went to that facility to have a look, that facility was deemed completely unfit for anybody to live in. Yet this is the facility that we had children in. And so to move them, they moved them to the old jail, which was unfit for the adults because they built a new jail, but they still considered that to be fit for children. So their human rights were just not upheld in any way, shape or form.
And,
so
and
I think
that's one of the challenges.
Upholding people's basic human rights should be, I guess, the starting platform for a lot of things.
Yeah, and one of the big challenges is here within Australia, we don't actually have, we're one of the only countries that are part of the United Nations that doesn't actually have a national bill of human rights. So we only have 5 rights guaranteed to us here in Australia, like the right to vote, freedom of speech, freedom of association, voting rights, and there's another one that I always forget, so I do apologize. But human rights aren't I don't want to say the priority, but if we had a better standards in which we were applicable to, I think there would be a significantly higher amount of accountability from those in power. So just quickly, do any of our participants have any more questions before we kind of start to go into the wrap-up phase of this presentation?
Alex, may I, I'm happy to, for the participants and attendees to share questions, but I wanted to pick up on something, Jason, earlier in your presentation. You mentioned about police culture as being a contributor to this, to the unsafe conditions and the mistreatment of the youth. Could you explain what you mean by that, by police culture? I guess, I don't know, just want to try to get a sense of what you meant.
Yeah, so in terms of police culture, I'm mainly referring to states such as WA and the Northern Territory, where we've seen a lot of stories coming out where police using too much force. There's a foundation of racism that's actually existing there in some police departments. So these are sort of more senior staff as well as junior staff. And there's footage online. You could literally Google footage finding prisoners being spoken to in a way that there's no respect there. There's no acknowledgement. There's just literally racism and other remarks that don't show any form of respect. So we can see, in WA, Northern Territory, they're 2 of the main, is this Alex's screen up here? You can see they're 2 of the main perpetrators there. And we do in the media see this quite often, is like a police officer speaking to Indigenous boys, children and girls in certain ways that almost perpetuates the idea, the whole issue. So that's when I'm referring to police culture, I'm referring to the issues that exist in police culture, the lack of education around Indigenous legal issues, because there's not enough training, in my opinion, there's not enough training around those issues. And I think that's something that should be consistent in terms of education. It shouldn't be a one-off, hey, you've completed this module as part of your practicing policing diploma. It should be ongoing. It should be relative to what's happening, to the context of what's happening in society at the current state in different states and territories. So I think that's one of the things I was sort of addressing with talking about police culture. But that's not to take away from the great thing that a lot of police officers do in our societies. I just wanted to kind of address the negative impact that some, a very small percentage, but albeit a very significant percentage, and the effect that they're having on this overall issue. So I hope that answers the question, Pat.
Sure. No, it does. I guess I think because I work along with some of the police training academies, and is this something that is a training related issue? Does it reflect something more broadly in those territories? So racism in the community in general. So, well, so really trying to, again, understand the problem. And then I think back to some of the context of what Sarah was sharing as far as, there are multiple different influences here. And if it's police culture, from a certain part of changing that organization and reframing sort of the mindset or even the type of recruits we have, it seems like then it's associated with the policing agency. If it's a community, cultural issues more broadly, then that's a different way of approaching. So I thank you for that. I think it's,
Yeah.
Can I just say, Pat, that in Australia, our police force doesn't need any real formal education. So you can get to a certain age and you can apply to the academy. And if you pass a basic test, both, psychologically and physically, you can join the police force. And I know from a lecture that I attended not that long ago that once you get in the police force, there isn't a lot of, they don't get a lot of training. So even in terms of mental health, and we all know, mental health is such a huge thing in all of our societies, they have 1 day of mental health training a year, yet they would deal with mental health issues every single day. But they're only taught that, 1 day a year. So I think it's going back to that education and educating the police force in what's led these Indigenous people to be in the position that they're in, particularly in Australia.
Yeah, and the challenge, as Sam identified, is each state and territory is quite a different approach. So I used to live in WA, and from the age of 16, you could become a police cadet. So it was a bit like the Army Reserves, for example. But to qualify as a police officer in Western Australia, once you went through the academy, you were sent rural for quite a substantive amount of time. And so you're sending teenagers and young adults into communities where they've got no clue. And so they're quite, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and have no real idea of, the world. So it is quite challenging. But even when mine and Sam's university does a Bachelor of Policing program, which is a pathway into the police academy. To put an example, when I was in undergrad, if students wished to do the only real mental health unit that we had, they had to put in a rule waiver and had to actually justify to the back teeth why they wanted to learn about mental health. But now that's actually changed, and our new students that are coming through are now having mandatory mental health as an entire unit of study. So things are changing, but when we talk about diversity and the diverse experiences from an intersectional approach, it's significantly missing from the conversation in terms of how we train our police and correctional officers.
You know, I think that's it. Oh, go for it, Jason.
I was just going to thank Sarah. I was just going to say quickly, just on that, I've just put an article into the chat there, which kind of touches on the issues of police culture with the question you're asking, Pat. So that's just one example of that happened in December last year. So this is just one example, and these come out regularly. So videos of police misconduct and just the way that they're speaking to these young men and the language that they use. It's crazy to see the effect that it has on these kids and the lack of respect. I think it goes to that, the lack of respect that these children get from authority. It's no surprise as to why there isn't a respect for authority in a lot of these communities. And I think that's kind of what I mean by police culture. I hope that helps as well. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to touch back on these points because I think they're so important, and I by no means am an expert in the criminal justice or policing system, but I know a lot about mental health. And we, you know, one of the things that has been a big conversation in the United States is that we have chosen as a country in a lot of ways to have police be the first responders for all types of crises, oftentimes for which they're not trained. And we know that the majority of folks who are incarcerated have mental health conditions that play a role in that space, and oftentimes are left untreated. And so one of the things that our community has done, for example, in the municipality, is put together a mobile crisis team that one of my doctoral students is actually helping to lead up, which is a collaboration between our fire department, our large hospital system here, and then us here at the university, in order to have mental health clinicians who are licensed to partner with fire to do outreach to folks who are kind of high users, if you will, of those call systems. And we don't have data yet because it's just getting started up. But we know that around the country, those sorts of mobile crisis teams are incredibly important. And they're moving resources in ways that are really helpful for communities because they're defining the problem more broadly. And whenever you bring in different people from different spaces to understand problems, then you get a much greater, broader definition of what's at play. And so I think solutions like that can be really creative if you get a lot of different folks in the room.
Yeah, I'd just like to say on that there was a community in Western Australia who was having lots of problems with, it was an Indigenous community, lots of policing problems with the boys driving without a license, having accidents because they didn't have a license, but in quite a remote place where there is no learn to drive school, resources are very low. And a new police officer went out there and thought, you know, we really need to do something about this. These children, you know, are having car accidents, they're killing each other. You know, they're not getting their licenses, they're not attending school, and so the impact was going on and on and on. So the police officers got together, and out of working hours, they came up with their own learn to drive school. And as police officers, they taught the kids how to drive. The kids got their license. It created a more collective community. The children started to drive their parents around a bit more, so there was less drink driving charges. The kids went to school. It just really changed the whole culture of the town, instead of the police culture that was there, which was just to keep locking the children up every time they did something wrong. So, you know, that was a really beautiful case of, you know, the police taking this, you know, whole community and thinking, what can we do to fix this community, rather than just doing their job, I guess, which was just policing.
I love that, Sam. I just dropped in the chat window one other article that folks might find interesting. Before I lived in Anchorage, I lived in Baltimore, Maryland. So fairly close to you, Pat. And I was actually there at the time when Freddie Gray was murdered. And some folks might know Freddie Gray was a young Black man who, well, nobody's been convicted for his murder, but died in police custody. And his death was ruled a homicide, but nobody's been held accountable. And there was this big question when Freddie Gray died, and we were having a lot of uprisings in Baltimore with a lot of particularly white affluent people asking the question, well, why did he run? Why did he run if he wasn't guilty? Why did he run? Why did he run from police? And our editorial board of the Baltimore Sun did a really beautiful piece. I think I use it a lot when I teach community psychology courses, of unpacking why he might have run. Of course, we can't know, right? But there are so many structures and systems at play. If behavior is not just a function of the individual, it is a function of context, which I think Jason and Sam, you've spoken to so beautifully. And in order for us to think about solutions, we have to go beyond, demonizing one another. And we have to think about how do we actually change structures and systems in order to support everyone in this space, both police officers and community members alike, because it's never somebody, for the vast majority of people, it's never their intent to harm, but we all live in this space. We all breathe in the smog of oppression. And so we oftentimes act in roles of oppressors without even noticing that. So I think it's in that reflexivity that we start to notice, how am I being oppressive, and how do I need to work to change systems to address these grave disparities?
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. All right, so just quickly, we're just going to do a bit of a wrap-up session. So just bear with me. So I know it's been quite a content-heavy morning and afternoon for us all. But if you just bear with me, I just want to wrap up both the pre and post, conference things that we have talked about, and just with some take-home points for us all. So on behalf of myself, Amber and Pat, I just want to thank all our wonderful panelists who have given up their afternoons and mornings. It was truly incredible. Big shout out to the awesome MVP Sarah DeLuca for all her incredible random emails at random hours when I had questions, and no question was too silly to ask Sarah, and so thank you very much for that. Just a big thank you to Richard and the board members for giving us the chance to run with an idea, and to Dr. Melissa Jardine as well, just for approaching myself and Amber with the, hey, do you guys want to take the reins from me and evolve this into something? So thank you for coming out and supporting us all. So just to kind of touch base and recap with everything that we've done. So we started off the conference with a simple yet complex question, and that is, what is human? And I think as we have gone through our discussions today, and many of you may have observed through the conference sessions that you have attended with this conference, is what is it? What does it actually mean to be human? So it's a challenging concept, and I think a real big take-home point is the more people we actually try to include in our definitions of human, the more we actually unconsciously exclude. So it's something that is really important to challenge yourself on. So for example, you may say a person is conscious, right? So to have consciousness, you have to have self-awareness. So what does that mean if a person is asleep, or if they're in a coma, or a baby? Babies don't develop self-awareness until they're 18 months of age. Are they human? All right. So we need to challenge our own unconscious biases as we start to unpack some of these complex questions, particularly within this SIG. So when we create something, we have to ask ourselves, is this inclusive of all people? And that's something that is going to just be an ongoing challenge and something that we have to continually reflect on. So you need to consider how you can make sure all people are experiencing the benefits of inclusiveness. And it's going to be an uphill battle. As Sarah eloquently pointed out, you have two people from different ends. They're both going to see the problem from a different perspective, but how do you bridge that divide? All right. So what this kind of leads us into is when we talk about dignity, respect, and dehumanization. And so I guess some homework, and I am going to give you guys homework, is how can we provide respect to people? Is respect something that is given or unconditionally, or is it something that's earned? And when we ask people these simple questions is, well, how does a baby earn respect? A baby has no way of earning an individual's respect, but it's just something that's given freely. So then, how do we then start to uphold a person's dignity? Right? So we have to meet people where they are at. We have to meet them in the conditions in which they are in. We have to come down to their level. And that's some of the challenges of being in academia. We kind of come and view problems from an ivory tower, and we step in and we step out, as our projects, emerge and wrap up and conclude, and we move on to the next one. So what might this look like in practice and, in academia and industry? So if we don't uphold a person's dignity, dehumanization occurs in it. And what we've started to identify is dehumanization is occurring quite frequently for many people from many walks of life. And whether or not this is overt or, it's done unintentionally, it still continues to happen. So how may this manifest in our behaviors? We have to start reflecting on these things. And what can you do to ensure dehumanization doesn't occur where you are in the world, in your small little organization, in the workplace, in your interpersonal relationships? Like we need to start reflecting on these broader issues in the world. So this is where the importance of our SIG is coming into play, where people's identities can no longer be ignored. All parts of what make a person unique must be considered. The more marginalized a person's identity is, the greater injustices they face. But we now need to start asking, why do they experience these injustices? Aren't we all human? Aren't we all entitled to be treated with dignity and respect? And when you start looking at things like statistical data that demonstrate quite heavily the differences of experience, it just demonstrates that we have a very long way to go. And how should law enforcement and public health change to be more inclusive? What does that look like? I know I certainly don't have the answer. I have an idea of what the answer may be, but it's something that is just consistently going to have to be challenged. And so this starts to lead us into some challenges that we have with power, control, oppression, and violence. So power doesn't occur in a vacuum. It serves a social purpose. It has a point. It's to, keep those in power in power. And so control is more likely imposed on those who are marginalized in any given country. So those who are disempowered and continue to be disempowered. Our statistics tell us these things consistently. It tells us the tale. We oppress them. And oppression can occur either overtly or it can be something that is significantly hidden and more sinister. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't challenge these things. But then we start to look at the different levels of violence in which people can actually experience in the world. And we have direct violence that occurs when society places greater barriers for specific groups of people. But it also is when we think of direct violence, it's wars. You know, it's people in, you know, going out of their way to, you know, kill the enemy. That's what we, you know, start to think of when we think of direct violence. And that's what we see at face value. However, as the image demonstrates of the iceberg, it's what's hidden beneath the surface that's actually more sinister. We don't know the lengths of what structural and cultural violence actually means. And so we need to start challenging the structural violence that people face with formal institutions. So it might be the barriers they receive to, you know, getting an education. It might be the treatment they receive when they go in and ask for healthcare. It might be the treatment that they receive that is different for in the criminal justice system. But no matter where it is, it's the structures that are perpetuating a different type of violence that is significantly problematic. But then we have to start reflecting on the attitudes of cultural violence. So we take these as absolutes, you know, as Sarah said, it's that, you know, when she was in Baltimore, in Maryland, there was a black guy that was killed because he ran from the police. But we automatically said, well, he ran from the police, so he must have been doing something wrong. That's cultural violence. We've taken that as an absolute, that because you've run from the police, inherently he's done something wrong. But it's unpacking those complexities. Well, hang on a second. Why? Why was he running from the police? There could be multiple answers. We're never going to know those answers because we don't have the capacity to have him ask those questions as to why. But we now need to start going beyond those, oh, well, you know, they were doing this, therefore that's the outcome. And that's as far as the conversation goes. So this starts to lead us into, I guess, wrapping up what our fantastic panelists have said. And so I asked them, what are some key points that you would like for our people to, you know, that participated today to take away? And so for Jason, he identified that the age of criminal responsibility in Australia should be raised. And as he accurately demonstrated in the poll for those people who participated, there's not just a one size fits all. But if we go by the United Nations recommendations, it's 14 at least. There are some places in the world where you can be 0. So we have to, you know, reflect on, you know, what our age of criminal responsibility should be. You know, a right to self-determination is essential for Indigenous people, but it continually is compromised. You know, additional funding needs to be provided to Aboriginal communities and organisations. And that again comes into the structures. You know, we have significant structural violence that occurs because these people are not meeting their basic needs. They're not experiencing, you know, the same treatments as if, you know, their skin colour was different. You know, so all levels of government need to adequately address findings and recommendations from the various royal commissions that we've had. And here in Australia, we've had significant amount of royal commissions into multiple issues. And the problem is, it's something that gets a lot of funding and to do, but not many changes are actually taken into consideration, which is really damaging because the findings of royal commissions are huge. And if we were to take the recommendations seriously, meaningful change would actually occur. So for Sam, you know, she identified that there's a real big challenge in policy. And so more diversity in the areas of health and well-being should be addressed by policies, engaging with boys and men in the development of policies that address their concerns. We have to have a system-focused understanding of how society constructs and engages men in daily life. And as Sam demonstrated at the end of her presentation, we're now in some places in Australia getting boys to apologize simply for the fact that they were born male, right? They have to apologize for simply being born the way they are. And so we also need to have an intersectional approach to understanding the needs of men and boys. And that's what Jason also touched on as well from an Indigenous perspective. You know, that's going to be very unique to non-Indigenous perspectives. So Sam would like to give you guys a bit of homework and ask, how are men represented in health and wellbeing policies where you are from? Are they inclusive? Are they not inclusive? What do they actually have to say? So then finally, this leads us into what Sarah had to say about definitions of problems is based on our worldviews. So as we've all started to demonstrate, it comes down to education, training, resources, and the simplicity of the answer. That is extremely challenging. You could have someone that is very educated that might not be taken seriously because the simple answer is the one that people can swallow and take as gospel. So we need to have a reflexive approach and interrogating what we have come to know and how we have come to know it, right? But what might this look like in your place in the world, right? So in closing, I think it's important that, we move forward with purpose, equity, and cultural safety. So cultural safety is an interesting process. So we have to have cultural awareness, but we also have to start demonstrating cultural competencies, and neither of these can occur without the other. So, but with cultural competency, it's also important to note that it does not have an end point. You don't just simply get a tick of the box to say, oh, I'm in culturally competent Indigenous issues, in issues of sexuality, in issues of disability, and so forth. It is an ongoing process. It's nothing that's going to be simply come to you just because. You are going to need to reflect on this as you grow through and go through life. So how can we move forward with purpose, equity, and cultural safety in our own research? What does this look like? In our workplaces, in our interprofessional and interpersonal relationships? What might this look like? And so in closing, I'd just like to say, we look forward to hearing your answers as times move on. So we're actually going to invite our wonderful panelists back towards the end of the year to have a recap session for them to, if they would like to participate, on what they've started to find. What do these conversations, have these conversations evolved? And just to remember that these concepts have no endpoint. It is a continuous process of learning, growing, and evolving as human beings. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for all your work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you,
It's my
Alex.
pleasure.
Thanks, Alex. That was
Thanks.
great. Lovely conversation.
Wonderful. I look forward to continuing and meeting up again in the near future.
That sounds
Thanks,
good.
everyone. Yeah. And to all of our attendees, if you have any questions, please, you have our contact information. Please do reach out to us. We'd love to kind of invite you to participate in this special interest group on intersectionality, which is part of the Global Law Enforcement Public Health Association. And this association really is, it's about 10 years in existence, and we exist so that we can bring together individuals who have a passion with trying to uncover or move forward, take action steps that are going to really bring about community safety and community well-being in a way, I think, that as this group has highlighted, that is grounded in a respect for individual rights, human dignity, and equality. So please, I welcome everyone to become a part of our association and this special interest group.
We're all nice people, I promise.
Thank you, Pat.
All right, so long. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
Right.